I'm going to get us started. I'm hoping that my screen share is working. Last thing you should see is my big face. I'm hoping that you'll see John Lewis when we honored him with our Statesmanship Award back in 2014. And you see Connie there, who then was the president of the association, and Emma Houghton, who was part of the introduction. And I just love that picture, A, because it's three of my favorite people, and B, because I think that picture right there says so much about John Lewis and says so much about the extraordinary public servant and the extraordinary man that we're recognizing today. So I'll be extremely brief. Our thinking is that through you, we can share a very special and personal side of John Lewis, you as his former colleagues and friends. And I've asked Connie Morella and Martin Frost and Ellen Weed to start us off, but really the way we're envisioning this is to give everyone a chance who wishes to share some thoughts to raise their Zoom hand and let us know also through the chat that they'd like to be recognized. And we've asked a good friend of the former Members Association, Lenny Steinhorn, who is a professor at American University, political pundit, a historian who's written extensively on the 1960s and on race in America, to kind of help us guide our conversation and give everyone a chance to share some thoughts about this amazing man we're remembering today. And just to get us started, I thought some words by the English poet William Wordsworth would be appropriate. What though the radiance which was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight, though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind. So with that, Lenny, the virtual podium is all yours.
Well, thanks so much. And I want to welcome everyone here. Pete, do you want to keep, all right, there we go. So the only request I have up front is if you're not going to be speaking, to keep your microphone on mute so that you know, no barking dogs or outside trucks get in the way of what people are trying to say. So I appreciate that. Look, I'm just going to say a few words and then bring it to you, because you are the ones who have the stories, the memories, the perspective, the sense of personal contact and interaction in ways that most people outside of the institution don't know. John Lewis had so many different chapters in his life. He was the son of tenant farmers. He, as we know, was a civil rights activist who fought against Jim Crow and got bloodied for the right to become a full citizen and the ability to vote. He was a community organizer and local elected official, and of course, he was a member of Congress. So this is a chance to celebrate his whole life, but those last 3.5 decades where he served with each of you, to make this country a more perfect union, really in many ways ought to be the highlight of this conversation today. So I'll just add one more quote from John Lewis to frame it, and then I'm going to kick it off with our immediate past president of FMC, Martin Frost. And so I quote John Lewis with this, and he said the following: "Do not get lost in the sea of despair. Do not become bitter or hostile. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. We will find a way to make a way out of no way." In any case, Martin.
Well, thank you, Lenny. I will try and be brief, but it's going to be very hard. The thing that, of course, I remember most about John, and I think everyone shares this memory, is his courage. John and I were about the same age. He was 2 years older than I am. He grew up in a segregated society as a poor black in Alabama. I grew up as a middle-class white in a segregated society in Texas. He realized early on that he needed to be in the middle of the struggle for civil rights. It took me a little longer to come around, but eventually, as late in my teens, I realized that segregation was wrong. My experience, I suspect, is like many of the people on this video today. But I was on the sidelines cheering him on. I did not have the courage that John Lewis had. I don't believe that I could have participated in a freedom ride and been beaten. I don't think I could have walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and been savagely beaten by troopers. But I believed in what John was doing, and it was an honor to serve with him. He was elected, he ran for Congress the first time in 1977 and lost, as many of us did in our first race. John then went into local government, the city council, came back and was elected in 86. I was elected in 78. I was there when John was elected. I got to know him. He was an inspiration to me and to, I think, everybody on this video today. My memories of John are very interesting because Alan Weed and I, who's on this Zoom today, worked on an organization called Impact 2000, which tried to promote fair redistricting for Democrats. And in 1992, the Republicans entered into a strategy of trying to make common cause with some people in the African American community in the South who felt they'd been, and justifiably felt they'd been discriminated against. But the Republicans tried to pack as many blacks as possible into as few new districts, thereby bleaching all the surrounding districts and turning them into Republican districts. John Lewis and Alan Weed both spoke out against this tactic and spoke for creating black districts, but not for trying to minimize the number of Democratic districts that surrounded them. John had, and I'm sure John did that at some risk to himself, because there were activists in the black community who didn't care about anything other than having as many blacks as possible in these new districts so that a white couldn't win the primary. John and I worked together on other things over the years. When I was chairman of the DCCC, I took him to Vegas to help raise money. Now you may ask, why did I take John Lewis? Well, John was on the Ways and Means Committee, as were several of you on this call. And people in Vegas really cared about folks on the Ways and Means Committee. I remember that John liked to gamble and he won. I'm not a gambler, I hate to lose. But John thoroughly enjoyed himself, and my guess is that he may have gone back to Vegas sometime after that. My other memory is so distinct. When I was caucus chair, I had a group of parents who brought middle school students up from Dallas to Washington, D.C. And they wanted to take those students in to see John Lewis. And I said, look, he's a very busy guy. He's a very important fellow. I don't know that I can do this. So I talked to John. He said, sure, bring them by. So I brought the students by. He did either 30 or 45 minutes with those students. He traced the entire history of the civil rights movement. We gave excerpts from some of his speeches and was just extraordinary with his time. And those students walked away with an experience that they could not have otherwise had. John was a wonderful colleague, a terrific man, and truly courageous. And I have some other stories, but let me yield to some of my other colleagues.
Alan, you want to take it from here, and then Connie, you'll take the baton.
Unmute. There we go.
Thank you. And I thank all my colleagues for joining today. And it's actually a little bit odd for me to speak of John in the congressional sense, because my knowledge and appreciation for John Lewis goes back so much further than when I actually got the opportunity to know him in Congress. I remember when my family first got a television, it was the very late 1950s, about 1959. And a television in our household, and it's a very political household, was used to watch the news of the civil rights movement. So John Lewis became a household name for us at that time. And I remember very formative memories seeing John Lewis and others beaten in civil rights marches and being physically scared to death myself, holding my mother's hand, marching in civil rights marches in Denver and in other places as we moved around being a military family. So when John Lewis actually came to Congress, and I was surprised that he came to Congress because Martin, you talk about gambling. All the betting was that Julian Bond was going to be the congressman, not John Lewis. So when John actually came to Congress and we started to have conversations, and we had numerous, one of the things that I wanted to ask him on a personal basis was wasn't he actually afraid during those times? Because I remembered an overwhelming personal fear as a child. And he looked at me and told me, yeah, that he was always afraid. And I asked him how he could do it then. And he said he knew he was doing the right thing, and that if all he had to endure was a beating in order to give people the right to vote, then he was willing to endure it. You know, I was in Congress before John, and physically I might have been a few inches taller, but whenever I looked at John Lewis, I was looking up. And, you know, we had our arguments from time to time in the Congressional Black Caucus, and the person who would always shut down every argument was John Lewis, because I suspect a lot of other people felt like I did. When John Lewis spoke, you were getting the authentic, honest voice of the right thing to do.
Thanks so much for sharing, Connie.
Oh, great. I first of all want to thank Pete for sponsoring this, Lenny for being the moderator, my friends Martin and Alan for coming together with this wonderful cause. Now, I must say, people have quoted already on this program, so I will quote a Scottish sage who said, "Death leaves a heartache that no one can heal. Love leaves a memory that no one can steal." And that's what we're all about. We're all about talking about those memories that we have, the lasting legacy of John Lewis. Okay, I lucked out. I was elected to the 100th Congress, which was the Congress that John Lewis was elected to. And we merged right away. I knew about his civil rights record. I was in great awe. I thought, gee, this is going to be a tough guy to get to know because of all he has accomplished. On the contrary, it was just the opposite. He was a gentle, unpretentious man who listened, who learned, who responded graciously, but with some oomph to it too. And so we became kind of bonded. Emil Houghton was in that class too. Interestingly, Kwesi and Fumi was also. And so we became very good friends. I can tell you that John, to me, was involved not only as a fighter for civil rights, but a fighter for civility rights. And he was a nice man that people liked, and yet he got his point across. At the time, and his views transcended the local United States, because he and I became co-chairs of the Freshman Congressional Caucus on Soviet Jewry. This was back shortly after we were elected, 1987, 88. And so we engaged in writing letters, giving speeches, traveling to Russia to talk about letting the Jews who were there that were not allowed to leave the country and were subject to such persecution, to let them go to Israel, let them go to the United States, give them some freedom. I am pleased to say that ultimately we were able to get a lot of the people who were freed, and Gorbachev came over and took care of a lot of that. But also I remember Ida Nudell, Vladimir Slepak, some of the key people who were part of the Soviet refusnik group. So my point is that he transcended so much by virtue of touching civil rights and human rights every place. I had the opportunity to go to travel to Selma at the 25th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday. This was in 1990. It was a group that John was in charge of with Emil Houghton. Emil Houghton was there pulling it together. So a group of members of Congress and some important leaders went on this trip over the Pettus Bridge. I never forgot that. Subsequent to that, John was involved with the, what was it called? The Institute of Politics and Government. And in that institute—
Faith and Politics.
Faith and Politics, thank you. And he was a chair of that. I know that Emil was involved with that too. And they were subsequently able to set up pilgrimages to the Pettus Bridge periodically. And so that was another legacy that continued with what what it stood for. I could go on and on, knowing that, for instance, in 1988, I had a reception at the Cannon Building for Black leaders in Montgomery County, Maryland, my district. And when they came together, John Lewis came in, and so did Nkwesi and Fumi. And I was so moved that here I was, a Republican. They came and they said, this woman deserves to be reelected. And that kind of said something about transcending politics to thinking about what can be accomplished. So there's so much that could be done. Finally, I was asked by my Black members of the fraternity that Martin Luther King belonged to, the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. They said, okay, Morella, we think you should introduce a bill to set up a memorial for Martin Luther King Jr. at the nation's capital. Well, I thought this is going to be kind of impossible, not to be funded by US government, funded privately. Well, it took many years, and that bill became the memorial. John Lewis was very helpful in so doing, and this, among everything else, becomes a great tribute to him. And it's very appropriate. His book is named, I think, Across the Bridge, because that's exactly what he did.
So let me pick up on across the bridge, even across the aisle. We live in such an angry era of politics these days. But if anyone had a reason to be angry, it was John Lewis. Yet he seemed to have this sort of a breadth of embrace, that generosity of soul, that willingness to speak to those people from Alabama or Mississippi who assaulted him physically and did bad things to him. Yet he was able to accept them, to hear their explanations and requests for forgiveness, and to be able to, create common ground. So how does a John Lewis escape this anger and create this generosity of soul? And what can we do as a people to follow a model like that?
Well, I think it had a lot to do with his deep faith, deep and abiding faith. And you really felt John studied to be a minister at one point. In his first book, he talked about preaching to the chickens when he was a kid out in the yard. I think it had to do with his faith, his unwavering faith. And John Meacham has talked a lot about this recently on television, and about how this was the core of John's being.
So that sense of redemption becomes an essential part of who he is, yes?
No question.
He has a comment in the book too. Choose confrontation wisely, but when it is your time, don't be afraid to stand up and speak against injustice. So I think it is listen, learn, respond when it's critical.
Alan?
No, I don't want anyone to get the sense that John was passive in his resistance. He was an active resistor. He was willing to take a beating physically, emotionally, in any way. But he did believe in standing up for all those around him who could not speak for themselves, and he always did. He also believed firmly that it was the best way to make a difference, to take that kind of a stand. So he often spoke about resistance and about the willingness to stand up no matter what the odds were against you. And I saw him do that over and over again in big ways and in small. And I really think that he inspired people to give more of themselves and demonstrate more courage than they otherwise might. And I know this is all about John, but I want to say just a word about Connie Morella, because these were the kind of relationships that John forged. When she talked about having Black members of Congress come and indicate that they thought she deserved re-election. The single greatest moment of personal humility that I ever saw in Congress was from Connie Marella in South Africa, who embraced a Black woman who was coming out of a mound of trash. And we asked the interpreter to tell us what the woman was saying. She said, "Crazy American woman, can't she see I'm covered in filth?" But it was that kind of feeling that John inspired, and I know he loved working on both sides of the aisle with anyone who would listen.
Speaking of both sides of the aisle, Phil, do you want to be able to contribute something here?
Well, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the association for putting this together. I think it's a wonderful thing. In the words of my former colleagues, I can't outdo as eloquent the words that you use. But I wanted, as a former member and a colleague from Georgia, Republican member, I served a total of 12 years with John. Of course, he served more than 30 years. But in our local newspaper, the Marietta Daily Journal here in Georgia, a couple of days ago, they posted a quote from John, and I'll read this quote. "Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." That's the end of the quote. What a tribute to John. I mean, we members of the Georgia delegation, whether Democratic or Republican, and I think there were 16 of us at the time, including the 2 senators, whenever we were on the floor and or met John in any circumstance, I mean, we stood in awe and great respect of him and what he had done during the nonviolent civil rights movement leading to the Voting Rights Act. I mean, what an icon. And it sort of reminds me of the movie, and I'm sure everybody has seen the movie To Kill a Mockingbird. And you remember when the trial was going on and the Black pastor was sitting next to Atticus Finch's little daughter, Scout. And as Atticus Finch was walking out of the courtroom, the pastor said to the little girl, "Stand up, child. Your father is walking by." Well, that's the feeling we had about John. He was a great American, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to say a few words of tribute on behalf of him and his wonderful family.
Pete, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, Phil, I don't know if you remember, but back in 2012, when you were chairman of the Congressional Study Group on Germany, you hosted a group of German parliamentarians in Atlanta, and you set up a meeting that involved Congressman Lewis. And I think we ended up walking from one building over to the museum. So we're crossing the street, and there was this group of high school kids who recognized him and made a point of crossing the street and flocked around him and took pictures and got his autograph. And if we had been with, an NFL quarterback, they could not have been more excited than they were to meet John Lewis and be able to take their picture with him.
Pete, I'm so glad that you reminded me of that. That's exactly right. I was chairman of the Congressional Study Group on Germany, and every other year. And it was the year that the members of the Bundestag were coming to Washington, D.C., and we spent a couple of days in Washington. As you point out, I was chairman of the group, and so we took the group to Atlanta and had that opportunity to take them to the King Center. And not only did John facilitate and make sure that we saw everything that we wanted to see, we wanted to show the members from Germany, he was there to meet us, to greet us, to meet and greet them, and probably spent 45 minutes just talking and going over everything and answering questions. And it was without a doubt, Pete, I'm sure you would agree, it was truly the highlight of the week. And I'll never forget John for that.
I was there too, Phil, and it was a highlight. It was very moving.
So it's interesting. I've had a bunch of
Thanks, Con.
former students email me unsolicited, saying in effect that the death of John Lewis was to them, as one of them said, a punch in the gut. People who never knew him, but knew who he was, what he represented, inspired by his vision, his courage, his willingness to create good trouble, as he used to say. So take it from those young people, let's say, to this next generation of members of Congress. And if, let's say, a newly elected member came to you and said, you know, this is what I'd like to be as a member of Congress. And what lesson from John Lewis might you be able to teach them as they enter that institution?
That's a complicated question, but I'll try to answer it, because what you would want to tell is to listen to all sides, to stand by your principles, and to try and work with people who didn't necessarily agree with you on every single issue, but to work the best you could with them, and to be you can't urge them to be physically courageous, because you're not going to have a situation like he faced, but to be courageous and stand up in the face of public opinion sometimes, and to always do what you thought was right.
Connie?
Yes, I would say respect, respect, respect. Just like George Washington's edict, you know, about when you're in the company of others, act with respect for those who are there. And when you respect, you are listening. You're listening to where they come from, your colleagues, what they care about, and you will then be respected by them, and they will be responsive. I think that's the beginning. I guess it's like get to know each other with an open mind, and then you can move mountains.
Alan?
I think John would indicate to members now that it's not just about being a member of Congress, it's about the work you do as a member of Congress. He came in when there were giants in the Congress, in particular, who had come out of the civil rights movement, people like Bill Clay and John Conyers, Lou Stokes, Charlie Rangel, but no one had more celebrity in the civil rights movement than John did. And yet he came to Congress and pitched in and worked the issues just like anyone else. And it wasn't that he didn't know that he was a celebrity. It's just that he didn't use that celebrity to promote himself. He used it to promote the causes in which he believed, always.
So there are two sides to John Lewis. There's that idealistic side who would speak of the beloved community, but there was also that practical side. The classic case being in 1963 at the March on Washington, when he wrote a speech that was rather fiery, critiquing the Kennedy administration, using language about Sherman marching on the South. And Kennedy people were upset. The Catholic bishops were willing to walk away. Martin Luther King went up to him and said, "You got to rewrite this." And so at the back of the Lincoln Memorial, he was sitting there rewriting his speech. Now, it was still a pretty, fiery speech, but it did take the edges off of it. So here was somebody who obviously lived his life through his ideals, but he also lived his life knowing the practicality of how to get things done. So how many of you actually worked with him on to accomplish things, to get things done, and to see how he navigated that side of John Lewis, which was the practical side?
Lenny, I think you've got some people out in the viewing audience who want to speak and who did work with him on committee and other issues.
So if there's anyone who would like to speak.
This is Larry Smith.
Jim. Okay, all right,
Yeah.
Larry and then Jim, okay?
Okay. Alan had it right. John wasn't very tall, but he was head and shoulders above most people. He had the natural person.
I think you're breaking up here.
As a leader years when he came to Congress, and I had two experiences in my whole career in Congress that stay with me. One was being able
Zoom is not perfect.
Yeah, it's all right. So Larry, you're breaking up. So why don't I kick it to Jim and then Mary Rose? And then if you're able to get back on better, we can bring you back here. Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Lenny, and Pete and the former members. Thanks for putting this together. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to express our love and respect and admiration for a man who I was deeply honored to know and serve with in the Congress. And as far as just a very practical achievement, John joined with me in introducing as an original co-sponsor the legislation to establish the Sumner School in Topeka, Kansas, as a National Historic Site regarding the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education case. And we introduced that bill in the House, and Senator Dole introduced a companion bill in the Senate. And John and I appeared before the appropriate committees in the House in promoting this, and we're moving it when Senator Dole, as a majority leader in the Senate, could uniquely do, took the bill and attached it to a must-pass appropriation bill, and it passed just, miraculously in a matter of a day or two. But John then later was able to come to Topeka, and it was really fun to tour that facility with him and show him what that legislation had accomplished. But what a remarkable guy. And when I think of John Lewis, I mean, the words that come to mind are obviously courage, as others have mentioned, but his deep personal faith that really informed his commitment, lifelong commitment to nonviolence, I think was so unique in the Jesus Gandhi tradition, you might say. And I think that he found great courage and quiet strength from that deep well of faith. And, his humility too was just incredible to me. And the quiet courage, the just strength of character that he just projected was remarkable. But I really had a lot of fun working with John. He ended up coming to Topeka twice. And on one occasion, we had a wonderful reception for him. A lot of people showed up. And to this day, I have a lot of friends in Topeka that tell me that meeting John Lewis was a very special experience for them that they will always remember.
Thanks, Jim. Mary Rose, you want to take the baton here?
Yeah, good to see you all, by the way. Thanks, Lenny.
Mary Rose, you have to unmute.
Is it unmuted?
Yeah, you're good.
Well, a lot of people used to want to shut me up, so I guess I'm not surprised. Anyway, I want to speak about John's kindness and humility because he was such a hero and so humble. And when he came to Congress, I really wanted to meet him because he was one of my heroes that I didn't know. And I couldn't believe that somebody of his caliber and what he had gone through for so many of our laws. When we Ohio, and he said, "Oh, I know who you are. You're vice chair of our caucus." He looked me up, and I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, I am proud of our nonviolent movement and what we accomplished, and so many helped us." But he said, "I want to ask your advice. I never did this before." So he asked me a couple questions about Congress and some of the committees and just a few little odds and ends. And I was so taken by that because here was this heroic person humbling asking me for advice. But another example of his absolute kindness was when Congressman Stokes, who I called brother, he called me sister, and we worked together for our constituents in Greater Cleveland and other issues. When he died, Congressman Lewis called me to tell me how sorry he was that Lou had died. And I could not believe that I would get this phone call from somebody I had served with 10 of my 16 years in Congress. He had been to Cleveland several times. And every time he came, I would try to be at the event that he was at. But for this guy to take time out to call me, of all people, because he realized our relationship, Lou's friendship with me. And I said, Congressman Stokes was one of my great, great heroes, as well as my colleague. And I never understood, I told him this quick story that Stokes had told me when he was in World War II, he was coming back and going to the South. It might have been Georgia. And he was in a bus with all Black members of the military. And in the front bus was the Nazi POWs and white military Americans. And they stopped to get food. And they would serve, the restaurant guy served the Nazis and the white men in the military, but would not serve the Black soldiers who had served in World War II. And I said, how do you guys do it? How did you become someone who was nonviolent when they fractured your skull? And he said, he said, first of all, I prayed that I would not react violently because it
Mary Rose,
if
you.
you're nonviolent.
Yep. We just lost you. You said he prayed that he would not react violently.
Yeah, he said he prayed that he would react nonviolently, even though it was tempting. He said, very tempting to fight back. But he said he knew that the movement's success depended in part by nonviolence.
Well, thank you.
And boy, is that a lesson.
And I got interrupted in the middle, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think your connection is better, so
Right.
please.
I had two great experiences, among others, in Congress. One was sitting on the floor talking to John Lewis. The other was sitting and talking to Claude Pepper, because they were basically kindred spirits. They were humble, they were intelligent, and they were fearless about confronting problems. I had the greatest respect for John. I remember once after I left Congress, I went to a fundraiser for Congressman Hastings, and John was the honored guest. And when he came in the room, the place erupted. More than they had erupted for Alcee. They were standing up and cheering for John. That's the kind of respect that he carried in that community and in all the communities. I was a vice chair of the DCCC. I specialized in going around raising money in the Jewish community. And I'll be honest with you, the one person that people asked for, even in our community, was, how's John Lewis? Who is John Lewis? How's he doing? Tell him we said hello. He just had that following because people really believed in him. And I was very grateful for the time that I would spend with him. There'll be very few like him, either before or after. In the Yiddish vernacular, he was a gitter neshama. He was a good soul. He was courageous and fearless, fought for his principles. What more could you ask of a man?
those of you who did work closely with him and knew him, what frustrated him about, politics? What are the things that he said, I wish it could be different? So frustrating. Anyone? Alan, Connie, Martin, anyone else? Vic? You got to unmute. You have to unmute, Vic. Yeah.
There I go. I would say that frustration wasn't something that really ate at John. John was in it for the long game. He didn't like to lose, but he also knew he had another day to fight. And so while many of us were very frustrated by fights that we fought that we didn't win, I know John has been, for example, way out front on gun issues. But John didn't let momentary defeat or disappointment eat at him. He stayed with it and knew that in time minds would change and people would come around. And he knew that because he knew people. He understood that politics was about people and not about policy as much. If you want to make good policy, know the people you're working with and who can be helpful to you at some point along the way. But I'd like to just give a personal vignette. We've all said a lot of things about John that we all feel deeply about. I guess I came into political awareness with the murder of Emmett Till, who was just 1 year older than I. I found out about racism, ended up leaving my parents' party and making politics and civil rights the main motivation for going forward into the career I ended up going into. By 1963, I was really deeply involved in my own campus and in the North, where I lived in New York State at the time. And I desperately wanted to go to the March on Washington. But I was working my way through college. My boss wouldn't let me off. And so I missed it. And for the next 20 years, before I got a chance to talk to John, I carried this liberal guilt around, about why I wasn't there when I should have been. So when John was elected, I went up and said, John, I gotta let my hair down here and say, I'm so sorry I wasn't there when your famous appearance and the wonderful speech of Martin Luther King all occurred. I felt like I should have been there. And he kind of gave me absolution. He said, it's okay, Vic, there's a lot more to life. Let's work together. Let's move on and do some things together. And I really appreciated him understanding it. It was great to get it off my back, honestly. But John was the kind of guy who really cared a lot about people who cared about the things he cared about. And that was faith in politics for him. Connie alluded to it earlier. I was on their board. It was very important to me when I got started. He and Amo Houghton were quite a team. They lasted a long time together. They really were the underpinning of that organization. They started that march on Edmund Pettus Bridge, picking up where John left off and making it now a rite of passage, a rite of bondage for members of Congress. I mean, most of us have been at least once, and it never would have become a way for people to show what was in their heart across party lines if John hadn't taken that experience of his and translated it into something we could all experience to some minor degree. He was a tough guy, but he was also, in a sense of toughness, a resolute guy. But he was a leader of his peers. He and Stokely Carmichael had a huge battle to see who was really going to run SNCC back in the day. And John won because John was not a showman. He was a plowman. He was going to be in it for the long haul, and I think his peers knew that and selected him. And that's what led to the speech at the Lincoln Memorial. So like all of you on this call, I thank the former members for setting this up. Under these COVID-19 circumstances, we can't get together very often when we really need to. And this is one of those times. And so let me personally thank you for doing this.
Some other thoughts. He often talked about the beloved community. And when he talked about that, it's a phrase, but what did that really mean? Obviously, he said that each generation needs to continue to work toward a more fair and more just society. And so there's no one single endpoint to the beloved community that he imagined. But if you had those talks with him about what he imagined for this country, what was that vision? What was that ideal? What was that sort of a point that he was working toward in his life? To pick up on Vic, he would call himself a tugboat and not a speedboat. So where was that tugboat leading us to? Anyone? Connie, you want to be able to chime in on that? You have to unmute.
Reminded by what Vic said and others of the 1963 speech of Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, and John was there, when he said to judge people not by the color of their skin, but by their character. And that's what he was always about. He always sought for the basic line, which was character, integrity, and he demonstrated that himself. And he gave people an opportunity to show their positive character too. So I just found the respect he had for others, his perseverance, his belief. He was a credible person. You believed him. He could say something and you'd say, this man does mean it and he's going to follow through. So I think it was those virtues, those values that he demonstrated to others in his demeanor and his actions.
Lenny,
Martin, go ahead.
add one thing. I went with him on one of those first trips to Selma to go across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And as a part of that trip, there were a number of the pioneers in the civil rights movement, almost all of whom has since died, who were there, and he introduced us to them. I knew who John Lewis was. I knew who Martin Luther King Jr. was. I didn't know to any degree some of the people who had worked very closely with him and had a chance to hear from them and to hear their story. And that was one of the most extraordinary, and this was very early in his career. It may have been the second or third year that he did this, and it was one of the most moving experiences anyone could ever have. And I'm forever grateful for the fact that he did that, not just for when I went, but for scores of people after that, maybe even hundreds of members who did that trip in later years.
Alan?
You know, when you ask about John and his view of community, his was a love for all humanity. And I'm going to reveal something about our CBC debates, and perhaps I shouldn't be even at this point. But one of the questions was whether white members should be allowed to join the Congressional Black Caucus. And there were only about 20 of us when John first became a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And his argument was always that without allies, we were not going to make progress, and that everyone deserved the benefit of the work for civil rights. And he would talk very movingly about white students on the freedom rides and how important they were to the progress that was made at that time. So John Lewis's vision was all encompassing. And just to throw in a word for the question you had asked previously about frustration, you stumped me with that one, because frustration was not part of John Lewis's repertoire.
And Alan, some of us got to be adjunct members of the Black Caucus. I don't remember what they called it, but we paid dues and we participated to the extent that the caucus wanted us to and permitted us to, and that was very important. I think L.F. Payne was trying to seek recognition. He was his seatmate on the Ways and Means Committee for many years.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, and thanks to FMC for setting this up, and Lenny for doing such a nice job of bringing us all together. I just wanted to comment. I was John's seatmate for a number of years on the Ways and Means Committee, and consequently got to know him as a wonderful, decent, humble, caring human being. And I remember one day I mentioned to him, I had a young friend who had other friends who were at Harvard at the time at the Kennedy School, and they were inspired by John and wanted to commemorate the Freedom Ride by coming to Washington and riding their bikes from Washington to Selma and stopping along the way and meeting with people and expressing their own feelings about racial equity. And these were young people who had been successful in their lives, but were making decisions about what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives. And John very graciously suggested that we all get together at the Chinese restaurant where he had had dinner with the people before the night before the Freedom Ride, and he would want to meet these young people and talk to them about what they were embarking upon. And so we did that. It was a memorable night. He talked about what it was like at that restaurant and the fear that they had, but they were so felt that what they were doing was so important as they began their own journey. And these young people then were had a chance to learn from and be inspired by John. And he talked a good bit about the Chinese restaurant and the fact that we all love Chinese food and we all love Italian food and we all love different cuisines, and that the diversity of our choices of food was something that should be instructive to us in terms of our diversity of race and how we should be able to try to understand other races just as we understood other cuisines and learn to benefit from and enjoy what each had to offer. And it was such a wonderful message. These young people left quite inspired. And that young person today is a person who served in the Obama administration, Sean Donovan, who is the Secretary of HUD and then became the director of the OMB, and just wrote a wonderful piece about John and how he had inspired him to public service. So I think, you know, John did many, many wonderful things, was a wonderful human being, a wonderful friend, but the fact that he could inspire future generations to want to do the kinds of things that he had done, I think is one of the great gifts that John had left for all of us. And I'll ever be grateful for the opportunity to be John's friend and John's seatmate.
Lenny, I got a message a moment ago from Jane Harmon, who's on the call, and she was asking whether there have been any announcements about memorial services or celebrations here in DC yet. I'm not aware of any. Is Lenny, or is anyone else on the call aware of it, of events that have been scheduled? I know it's hard to do these events where a lot of people congregate, but people want to be able to pay their respects.
I don't think there's been anything formally planned yet, and I'm sure that FMC will alert everybody as soon as they do hear anything. I do know that Charlie Dent and Dave Skaggs want to say something. So Charlie, you want to unmute and say something?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Hey, I just wanted to, I obviously served with John like so many of you on this Zoom call. I didn't know him as well as many of you, but I just want to share one fun story that I had with John Lewis. When the movie Selma came out, of course, John was a prominent figure in the movie, and we had a wonderful experience and opportunity to have a previewing of the movie in the Capitol, in the Visitor Center with John Lewis. There's not very many of us, some members and some staff, and I always cherish that time we had together, and it's kind of fun being part of that historical moment, or at least enjoying it through film. And the second thing I just wanted to mention about John, that I always liked the way he would greet me, and I think he did this to probably many others. I wasn't that special. He would often say, "Hello, my friend," or "Hello, my brother." It always was there's a real sincerity to that too, the way he would approach you and really put you at ease, knowing that you were speaking to this historic figure. So that was my 2 cents worth, and what a great guy, and he helped make our country a better place.
So seeing the film about history with a central character in that film must have been quite an experience, huh?
It was indeed.
Dave Skaggs, and then Norm Dix, I think you may want to contribute.
Thank you.
Thank you, and again, thanks to FMC for doing this, and great to see so many colleagues there. My ears perked up when Alan tweet described John as a celebrity, but he didn't act like a celebrity. I think he knew he was a celebrity, but you'd never know that he knew he was a celebrity. I mean, it was that humility and unassuming nature that was so powerful. My last time to see John, and it's why I wanted to speak, happened one afternoon when I, before the meeting, had been at the soldiers' home in Northwest Washington where the Lincoln Cottage was being dedicated. My wife worked for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and it was the trust that was in charge of the restoration. And so immediately before going to the Capitol to see John, I spent several minutes in silence in the room at Lincoln Cottage, where Lincoln had written the Emancipation Proclamation. So the combination of being in that place and then seeing my classmate, John Lewis, to talk about, I forget what we talked about even, was very powerful and very memorable. And so I will always associate those two in my mind with enormous affection. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave, Norm?
Well, thank you for putting this together, and the former members group has again proven how important it is. I served with John Lewis for 26 years in Congress. And as a child growing up, my parents took a trip across the country to New York and Washington, D.C., and we traveled down for my first time in the South, and I saw signs that said whites only. And I turned to my parents and said, what is this about? Because we out in the great Northwest, fortunately, didn't have to go through the kind of things that John Lewis went through in devotion to civil rights. And I just decided right there and then that, that was wrong. And I got to know John during our service in the Congress. And I was always impressed with him. I was impressed by his speech at the Washington Monument. And the last day I was in Congress, we had a Democratic caucus, and Pelosi called on me to say a few words. And just as I was going to speak, John Lewis said, "Norm, don't make me cry." And I said, "Oh, John," and then I cried. And I mentioned a couple of issues, things I would care about, like cybersecurity and the climate change. And but what I should have said, and what we should take from John's great service, is we've got to keep working on the Voting Rights Act. Now, I don't want to be partisan here today, but the Voting Rights Act has been weakened. This was one of the things that John cared about greatly. And also on gun reform, that is another issue that he cared about. But I was always impressed by his warmth, his friendliness, his courage. To see those photos of him going across the bridge. And of course, one of the last ones was with President Obama. That was very striking. And he was a great member and a good friend, and we miss him. Thank you.
Russ Carnahan, you have to unmute.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, FMC, for doing this, and shout out to my Missouri friend, Alan Wheat. Just a couple of quick comments. My wife, Deborah, and I took our 15-year-old son, Andrew, to one of the civil rights pilgrimages, and to see the impact that it had on his life was really remarkable. We got to see George Wallace's daughter introduce Eric Holder as the first African-American Attorney General. We got to see all these famous civil rights speakers give these remarkable speeches and sermons, and our son looked at us and said, "Dad, if we had preachers like this, I'd want to go to church every Sunday. Then on the plane ride on the way back, he said he wanted to be a civil rights hero too.
So we're about at the little over the end of the hour that we had planned. And so, you know, everything that everyone has said here, I've personally found inspiring. And if I were to speak to my students talking about John Lewis, I would pick up on so many of the things that you all said today, that he led by the power of example, the power of courage, the power of humility, the power of narrative, and the power of principle. And I would tell my students to seize that power and make a difference just as John Lewis did throughout his life as best as you could. And I do think that in many ways, when you see all of these young people inspired by what he did, who he was, what he fought for, the courage he showed, I think there's no greater legacy for anybody than to inspire a new generation. And so many of your comments today spoke not only to how he inspired you, but to how he inspired everybody around you, young people, people in your community. And I think there's no greater tribute to anybody than knowing how much he inspired an entire nation. So I think we will sort of close it at that. And I want to give my greatest appreciation to everyone for being here, for Martin, Alan, Connie, for kicking things off and sharing their experiences and perspectives, but also for everybody else. But in many ways, we all have to give our biggest thanks to the person who may not have been tall in height, but as some of you said, was so extremely tall in stature. And this is somebody that I know that all of us can look up to for all of our lives. So thank you all. This was quite moving, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to have been part of this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Lenny. Appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks, Lenny. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great to see you all. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful service.
Thank you.
Nice.